Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Dairy Farmers Digest. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. I'm really excited today to have Dr. Geoffrey Dahl on. Geoffrey is the director of the Feed the Future Lab Innovation for Livestock Systems with the University of Florida. And then it says you're Harriette B. Weeks Professor, President of the American Dairy Association as well. And I guess you're a past president of the ADSA?
Yeah, that was a few years ago. I was president of American Dairy Science Association, correct.
I'm really excited to have you on today. Like I mentioned there just before we got recording, I've mentioned your name a lot on this podcast when talking about heat stress, and we're in the throes of it right now. I know the last couple of weeks here in Ontario have been a little bit cooler and damper, but we've had some pretty severe bouts. And I guess one thing I kind of want to preface too is I went to California in 2019 thinking that, we're going to learn a lot about heat stress. And then I think in 2020, I went to Florida and I picked up way more stuff in Florida just because I think our climate here in southwestern Ontario is a lot more similar to what yours would be in Florida with the heat and humidity, like not to the extreme, but I think there was some more common practices and things that we could pick up there. So I'm excited to have you on today.
I grew up in Massachusetts, and so I think that summers in that area, Massachusetts all the way across to Michigan, Wisconsin, are going to be similar to what we have here, sometimes hotter. I mean, we don't get as hot as some of those areas can get from a high temperature standpoint. The humidity may not be quite as bad, but that's what we see is hot, humid weather. And so, as you said, places like California, some that are a little more arid, you get some night cooling. I think that they can take some different approaches to dealing with heat stress.
It's hot no matter where you go this time of year, right across Canada and the continental U.S., right? So,
right.
Why don't we start this off and maybe just talk to the audience a little bit about your history and how you got to the University of Florida?
Well, I, as I said, grew up in Massachusetts, did my undergrad degree at the university there, and then went to Virginia Tech, degree in dairy science, more related to nutrition, and then did my PhD at Michigan State in lactation physiology, postdoc for a while, more in the reproductive neuroendocrine area, and then faculty positions at Maryland, at Illinois, and then finally here at Florida about 17 years ago. And most of my work has been related to either lighting or heat stress, and they have kind of some similarities in terms of the physiologic impacts of those. And so that's how I've kind of transitioned off of lighting photoperiod work into heat stress.
So I imagine as somebody who wanted to study heat stress, you just got sick of the cold winters. You couldn't do any research.
Well, that was certainly one of the advantages of coming to Florida.
Yeah, no, I've been down to the campus there at Gainesville, and it's a really nice place. And you guys have a really nice facility there for doing research as well at the research farm. So
yeah, we like it. We've got large enough herd that we can really do some interesting work relative to some other places that may not have the number of cows that we have to put on studies.
So I guess the hot topic today, sorry for my bad pun, but is heat stress. So I think what we'll do is, because I know heat stress affects the entire life cycle of the dairy animal and beef and sheep and most ruminants and even monogastric livestock. But since we're a dairy focused podcast, maybe I think we'll start with the lactation cycle and kind of work our way backwards down to the calves, because I know there's been a lot of research on the impact of heat stressed calves in utero and colostrum absorption and whatnot. So maybe just walk us through a little bit about what happens to a heat stressed cow when she's in her lactation cycle.
Yeah, well, let's focus on lactation first. Animals that are producing that much milk, eating that much feed, produce a lot of heat. And so they've got a lot of metabolic heat that they're trying to get rid of. And so when we layer on top of that ambient heat from the environment, it makes it more difficult for them to get rid of that heat. And so when they're heat stressed, they end up consuming less feed because they're trying to adapt and adjust to those conditions. That means they're going to make less milk because of the lower feed intake, but they also then have to make metabolic accommodation to get rid of that excess heat, and that takes energy. And so to get rid of that heat, they take energy that they could use for milk production and put it towards trying to maintain their thermal regulation. So those animals will reduce the amount of feed intake. They will reduce the amount of milk that they produce beyond what we might have expected with the drop in feed intake. And they will recover differently depending on the stage of lactation that they're at. And we've actually found recently, working with a former student of mine, Sha Tao at the University of Georgia, that early lactation cows and cows kind of at the end of the lactation seem to be a little more resilient than those mid-lactation cows. And what I mean by that is the animals in mid-lactation, when they're heat stressed acutely, they tend not to recover as quickly as those other early or late lactation cows. So there may be some perceptions that, oh, well, early lactation cows are the ones that would be most negatively influenced by heat stress. That may not quite be the case if we're looking at the sort of extended effects of heat stress on those animals.
I understand with the fresh cows, fresher cows, just because there's a lot of, generally their feed intake's higher metabolically. I think they're working a lot harder, and just there's a lot more going on, like immune system wise too. Like I know a lot of their immune systems will be activated at that time, so there's a little bit of a, I guess, a glucose partitioning towards that. But why the mid lactation? Like you'd think once they get their milk curve kind of set that they would kind of stick close to it. And you know, from the field, you talk to farmers about heat stress cows, and a lot of it, the blame gets laid on the late lactation cows not recovering. And now you're kind of busting this myth and saying, no, it's more the mid lactation animals that have the greater effect.
So obviously, I think I mentioned training as a lactation physiologist, everything's going to come back to the mammary gland for me, just like, you know, nutritionists are always going to come back to ruminal activity and that type of thing. But when you said that they kind of established their lactation curve, that's exactly right. But to get to that peak of lactation, we have to have two things: maximal number or capacity of mammary cells, and then we have to have those working as hard as they're going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we move beyond the peak, really that decline in the lactation curve, a lot of it is turnover of cells and loss of cells from the mammary gland. And so my interpretation of these mid-lactation effects are that those animals, because they're not still sort of on the upward trajectory, can't recover as well as the animals in early lactation. And the late lactation animals, you just probably don't see it as much. They've already declined. And so I think that there is a sort of a plasticity that occurs early in lactation that allows them to be more resilient. And then later in lactation, we just don't observe it because the animals are at a lower level of output.
That's an interesting observation. I love doing the podcast sometimes because I have a lot of myths busted when you're thinking about these things. So, what are some of the other biological impacts that are affected by heat stress? Like I know repro's often an issue. I know when I was down in the Southeast US, like everybody talked about having real great preg rates, except for July. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, what that sort of means is somewhere the process is breaking down, and what it appears to be, at least from my understanding, talking to colleagues that work in the area, is you get a lot more early loss of those embryos with heat stress. And so we've worked on that quite a bit. There's been a lot of work done, and just on the management side as well, making sure that cows are kept cool and that. So many of our larger farms that are using time breeding and that type of thing really don't experience that same loss of reproductive performance in the summer they used to. Matter of fact, some of our better farms really don't have any seasonality to that at all. They were at such a high level of performance that they aren't seeing that anymore. But much of it would be due to the elevated temperature and the effects, and not all of them have been worked out, on early loss of those embryos, and that heat effect not only on the cow but on the embryo itself.
Yeah. So is it that they're not conceiving, or it sounds like more that they're
Right.
losing that embryo before, either before a
Exactly. They
preg check or
conceive,
right after?
and then it's in that early development stage, and you can see that, you can regenerate that in the lab, right, where we have IVF experiments and other ones where you'd go in and heat some of those embryos up, and you can see the effects specifically of the heat rather than an effect of the cow or anything else.
Yeah. So that just comes back to maybe some of these higher producing herds are also have better heat abatement in the barns and better cooling and better management just in general, and maybe you don't see that seasonality effect anymore.
Exactly. I would say, though, that, we're going to talk about dry cows. There's certainly an impact there that we're interested in pursuing more as well, because clearly those animals that are going to be heat stressed, even when they're dry, so when they're carrying that calf that's about to be born, we still have to remember that all of the follicles that are going to be ovulated then, particularly early in lactation, are already sort of in the developmental trajectory. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are effects on those follicles as well that may influence their reproductive performance in the next lactation. And in fact, we've got some evidence that that's the case. We had, just looking at seasonality, we did a study on a large commercial dairy where we took records from animals that were heat stressed that were dry during the hotter months versus the same genetic makeup, same herd, everything
Mm-hmm.
else is the same management wise, that were dry during the cooler months. And we saw negative impacts just of that time that they were dry, being in the heat stress season, on their reproductive performance.
So there's quite a bit of lag in that then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe that's why we see more of those issues arise kind of in the fall, because it just takes some time
Exactly.
to manifest it, right?
Exactly.
Interesting. Back to like the energy thing that we were talking about earlier. Like a cow has to, like, they're going to eat less, but do they not also have a higher maintenance requirement in the summer as well?
Well, I suppose it depends on whether they're heat stressed or not. I don't know that their maintenance requirement per se changes, but the energy that's going to be going towards maintaining body temperature at a normal level would be more, just because they've got it's not like in the winter when they're producing so much heat that their body temperature, their thermoneutral zone is maintained because they're within that. We're moving them outside of their thermoneutral zone with heat as well as you can do with cold. It's just that it has to be extremely cold, and you'd have to starve them probably to really
Yeah.
see some of those effects. But on the heat side, they would have to use more energy to get rid of that excess heat.
And that's just like an increase in respiratory rates and just like metabolically, like that cow's just under stress. So she kind of
Yeah,
kicks it to the next level.
right. I mean, it's moving one way or another, right? And it's just prioritization, and that prioritization of maintaining body temperature is more than providing nutrients to mammary production.
Yeah, because isn't there like a almost a checklist like a cow goes through? It's like, okay, if I'm gonna be in a lactation cycle, my first bit of energy goes to stay alive, then my next energy goes to production, then my next energy goes to reproduction. Like inherently, they've already programmed themselves to know where they have to partition energy. So it's just, I guess we just have to help them in the summer, make sure that they can kind of follow that list as well.
Yeah, and I'd say it's not necessarily, that may be a little bit too simplistic, but I think you're on the right track of they've got a prioritization of things that they're going to be addressing, because we know that, even a heat stress cow can become pregnant and she can still
Mhm.
produce milk, and a 2-year-old can still grow, but the levels of all of those in terms of her peak performance is probably going to be reduced.
And then On the dry cow side, like I know we touched on that a little bit too. Like I know here in Ontario, or I guess kind of the upper Midwest, I could kind of classify us as well. We feed a lot of high fiber, kind of low energy density diets in the summer. And I know there's a lot more heat generated from a cow trying to digest that. Like how much of effect does that have on, a dry cow if uh through the summer months?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We haven't looked at that specifically in terms of different diets and how that might influence them. Dry matter intake level is significantly reduced in dry cows as well, right? So
Yeah.
we're looking at about half of the sort of normal intake in that 11 to 12 kilos a day dry matter on many of our studies. So I don't know that it would have as much of an effect as on in a lactating situation. But certainly there is going to be an element of heat generated from whatever diet we're feeding them. And if we have a very, what I'll call, high fiber diet,
Mhm.
that may make the problem worse. But it's not like we can do a high energy diet and get away with not having the problem.
What's going to cause us more of a problem, having fat
Yeah,
cows that calve out in the heat, or having
right.
cows that maybe eat a little bit less during the heat? And
The other thing to remember is that all of the responses that we see in dry cows, you can't really explain them too much by, and part of them might be because of the reduction in intake, but this is not a dry matter intake sort of driven process. There's been one study that they did with pair feeding, and it maybe explains 30% of the differences. Um, we see physiologically that there are differences in those animals that affect mammary development, and then that mammary development plus all of the other factors that go along with it are going to be reducing the capacity for yield in that next lactation.
yeah, so with that, is it like because like they're using the dry cow period as a regenerative time for their mammary gland, like so it sounds like there's a lot of impact that heat stress can kind of, I guess, be an antagonist on that process.
Yeah, and you know, sort of our working model, big picture is that there are impacts early in the dry period and there are impacts later on in the dry period because it seems like they're doing nothing, right? And it's just a static sort of, oh well, she sort of had a reduction obviously in the amount of milk she was putting out, and suddenly that milk is kind of resorbed, and then she's dry, and then the week before she calves in, she starts bagging up, and boom, it's just kind of in between. There's nothing going on. Well, that early dry period, we think, is really setting the stage for what happens later on. And in particular, there's a lot going on that is linked to immune function
Okay.
because immune function is important, obviously, for getting rid of pathogens and responding to pathogen insults, that type of thing. But your immune system also does a lot in just terms of tissue turnover. And so as the animals go dry and the signals are that we're going to have an opportunity for some changes from a mammary remodeling perspective, that immune system has to be at peak performance at that time too. And so if it's not, because she's heat stressed, and we know that has negative impacts on immune function, then those animals may not be set up as well
Mhm.
to then go into the proliferative phase and take advantage of the physiology at that time. So, you know, early on, we want to kind of get rid of and turn over some of those cells in the mammary gland and set the stage for increased proliferation later on. And that heat stress, it looks like, negatively impacts the first phase and the second phase. And we can see, we did a study a few years ago with switching animals. So they were heat stressed for the first half of the dry period and then cooled, or cooled and then heat stressed the last half of the dry period. And in both cases, they weren't any different from animals that have been heat stressed the whole time. So
Hmm.
keeping them cool the whole dry period is important to really see the positive effects of that cooling when they're dry. And we think that's because there are these two phases that are both important to maximize capacity for that next lactation.
I know one of the most kind of thing, I guess one of the most important things that I've noticed or learned over my career so far is that, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, the far off dry cow was a complete afterthought. Nobody ever thought about, heat abatement or feeding that group properly. As just put them to pasture, put them back in that old bank barn, and we'll deal with them when they come up to the close up pen. And everybody kind of seemed to focus on the last 3 weeks before calving, but like with people like you, like we're just learning so much more about the entire dry period and how critical it is on on that animal's future production.
Yeah, I sometimes sort of remark that I don't really like the term transition period because it allows us to ignore the first half of the dry period.
Yeah.
And it is a really critical phase. And I think we're learning more and more that what happens in the dry period really influences how that animal performs, as you said, for that entire next lactation. And we can screw up more in the dry period in terms of that animal's performance than
Oh
we can
yeah.
ever fix in lactation. And so we have to again readjust our thinking a little bit so that we really focus on making sure that those cows for the entire dry period are managed properly. And then, you know, what we do in lactation, we can do even more. I mean, if we've got better managed animals in the dry period and we have good management in lactation, we should have high levels of performance throughout.
Well, I mean, I see it every day with dairies is that the dairies that do a really good job managing their dry cows and their calvings and any maybe metabolic diseases after calving, which typically I think there's less if you manage that dry cow properly. There seems to be less sorry, I won't use the word transition, but there seems to be less metabolic disorders at calving. And it just seems like those herds just kind of everything else falls in line. There's good milk production, there's good component production, there's good reproduction. Like it just seems like, I wouldn't say easy, but easier than, if you're battling some kind of issue through the dry period, whether you didn't treat them right at the beginning or there's, space limitations, heat abatement, like you name the stressor that we put on that cow.
Yep, yep. And all we have to do is remember that, uh, you look at the times that cows get sick, right?
Yeah.
Disease incidence peaks when? Peaks right around dry off and around calving. And
Yeah.
so we have had that knowledge for a long time, and yet we've kind of ignored it from the management perspective. We just say, oh, well, that comes with the territory. It doesn't. It's partially influenced by how we manage those animals. And as you said, that multiple stressors that those animals are going under, we don't need to add to it with probably the most significant stress that they experience, which is heat stress.
Yeah. Um, what about the calf in utero? Because this is where I'm completely amazed by the work that you do, is looking at what happens to that calf during, I'd say like the last trimester,
Mhm.
or is it the whole dry period, like since conception? Like, is there effects from epigenetics there? Or is it mostly just in kind of the end?
Yeah, there probably are some effects, but the predominant effects are towards the end, which, I have to admit, when we first started looking into this, I would have thought, those calves are pretty bulletproof at that point. They should be, pretty well developed. I mean, you've had cows calve at 8 months or less, and the calf lives, so
Mhm.
they're there. But what we see is, and a lot of our studies, just to preface this, we kind of go with a 6 week or so dry period, so it's not even the full 60 days. We're
Mhm.
seeing these impacts with just 6 to maybe 7 weeks dry. The calf is very responsive to heat stress at that time, and it's going to reduce body growth. We know that. They calve in a couple of days, few days earlier, so part of that is just less time in utero. But there are longer term impacts of that heat stress on those calves beyond that early life 2 kilo drop in body weight, because that persists at least through a year of life, that they are at a lower body weight. We've got evidence that they're probably stature challenged as well, right? They're not as tall as the calves that would come from a cooled dam. There's all kinds of immune function or immune status reductions in those animals. primarily because their ability to absorb immunoglobulin from colostrum is reduced when they've experienced heat stress in utero. So there are all these impacts physiologically that are programmed by that heat stress late in gestation. And part of it is an adaptive response, so that those animals will then, enter an environment where they've kind of already shifted their physiology to most appropriately deal with that environment. But that's not the case, right? With our animals now, we manage them with heat abatement and other things. So, but that's the at least our thinking is that it's an adaptive response with those animals. Ends up being those animals are more able to deal with an acute heat stress event, but we pay for that every day in the fact that they are less productive. So that's one of their adaptations. We're a less productive animal. We probably are better able to deal with higher temperatures.
Yeah, the colostrum thing's interesting too, because like with the effect of that in utero, is it just because she's in the cow and, maybe, like this area, we're feeding a high fiber diet. So we're maybe creating more heat stress and then that calf is growing there. Or is it simply because they don't get enough absorption of colostrum in general, and maybe some of those other nutrients that we don't maybe know about yet, like they're just not getting adequate levels of those?
Yeah, that was our question as well. So we've looked at that a couple of different ways. The first one, when we looked at just straight immunoglobulin uptake in the calves from the heat stress versus the cooled dams, they got the same volume of colostrum. The colostrum Ig content wasn't different, but the
Mm-hmm.
calves that were heat stressed, less uptake. So the problem with that study, or the limitation of that study, is, we pointed out, was that they all got colostrum from their mom. So it could have been something else, as you point out,
Yeah.
in the colostrum that's influencing their capacity for absorption. So we went and looked at that, and that study, the next study, pretty convincingly said that it's not the colostrum. It's not something about the colostrum, because we fed colostrum from heat stress cows to calves that were born to a cooled dam, didn't affect them at all. We fed colostrum from a cooled dam to a calf that was born to a heat stress dam, still had poor uptake.
It's a calf
So
issue.
yeah, and
Yeah.
we've since gone on and looked at it looks like the impact is on their gut development. That gut closure process is really about the turnover of the enterocytes, the cells in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And so at first, there's what we call, not, they're leaky tight junctions between those cells, that first layer. And as that first layer turns over, that's when we start to get those tight junctions formed in that first day of life or so. And that's when we stop having the capacity to take up those large molecules like immunoglobulins. Well, that process, a turnover, seems to be accelerated in the
Really?
calves that have been heat stressed in utero versus the ones that are cooled. So the gut closure process is already well underway before she even hits the ground. And we think that explains their lower ability to absorb immunoglobulin. So you can't just give her more.
Mm-hmm.
You can't try and correct it after the calf is born. You got to correct it beforehand by making sure she's in a cooler environment, that mom is in a cooler environment.
So, like, that's just super interesting. So, is that like a defense mechanism then, like for pathogen uptake? Like, they just want to get that gut closed up, or like,
Yeah,
it's
well,
fascinating.
yeah, and we don't really know from an evolutionary perspective what that adaptive advantage might be, whether it would be or not. It could also be that I put it as the gut closure process is accelerated. It could also be that it takes a certain amount of maturation in utero to fully
Mm,
sort of have that process occur. And so maybe the fact that they're born a few days earlier means that they haven't gotten full maturity of the ability or the capacity to take up immunoglobulin. It could be that it's more related to that rather than an adaptive mechanism in those
yeah,
calves.
like that's super interesting. Um, and then with the calf, like if you're looking at the life cycle of a pre-lactation animal, like we'll start at the calf and go right through, like
Mhm.
once they've already lost that little bit of birth weight, are they always behind the 8 ball per se
So yeah,
with average daily gain?
So we looked at it at first just through weaning, and they maintain a lower birth weight or body weight to weaning. And then we looked at it in a larger group of animals. Once we started accumulating these calves over time, they seem to be at a lower body weight through a year of life around puberty. But then when we've looked at those animals, those same animals at calving, their body weight at calving wasn't different. So they've had some compensatory gain between year 1 and year 2 of life, but it's likely that the composition of that gain is not the same, right? So those
Yeah,
calves,
it's not like structural gain. It's like
it's not
it's
lean growth.
fat.
Exactly. It's less
Yeah.
productive tissue. And not that fat
Yeah.
isn't all, unproductive. You got to have some of it
Yeah.
to mobilize. But for sure, I think that we haven't done those slaughter studies yet, but those animals would be, I think, on a higher fat content and probably shorter stature at that time too, because they are up to a year of life or so shorter as well.
Yeah.
So waist height's going to be reduced. And that's probably explaining some of the lower productivity in those animals. But there's also very clearly visible effects on mammary development in those animals. We did a recent slaughter study where we looked at we had calves that were born to heat stress dams or cooled dams and sacrificed them at birth, sacrificed them at weaning, and when we started dissecting out the mammary glands, you can see that there is less, just to the naked eye, less potential mammary tissue at birth, at weaning. And looking at proliferative effects and other, at the more cellular level, it all tells the same story, that animal has been sort of set up for lower productivity. It's a lower productivity phenotype.
Do you see increases in morbidity as well?
We do. We see that the survival in those animals all the way through, and for this, we've looked at up to 5 years of age. And you just see that those animals always have, it's kind of a parallel line, but it's always below the line that we would see for survival in the herd of the animals that were born to a cooled dam.
So just a
And
little
then
more
they also,
sickness, a little bit higher culling rate. Like,
poorer reproduction,
yeah,
she's at the lower end of productivity. I mean, all of those things lead to that group of animals just not hanging around as long. It's about a year less time in the herd for,
that's pretty significant.
well,
That's a lactation, really.
when we think about longevity, for sure. And we've
Yeah.
actually now gone back and looked at some records from a few herds, Florida and California, that have good records and have the numbers of animals that we need. And when we look at animals that were in their 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th lactation, about 2/3 of those animals were born in the cooler season versus animals that were born in the warmer season.
Just by
So,
looking at date of birth.
yep.
Yep.
And so it just sort of tells the story that, our controlled studies are really telling us what the biology is, but then you see it in records at the farm level.
It's kind of like that trifecta. You've got it confirmed almost because you're putting the whole pieces, all the pieces of the puzzle together. So to kind of build off that, like what can producers do at their farms to help mitigate the heat stress? Because obviously there's the biological impacts, but there's also a financial impact to it. And if you're saying, you get one less lactation out of an animal or a year of life, like that's pretty significant.
Yeah, we've done the financial estimates both on the cow, so what she's going to do in that next lactation, just looking at productivity. And then when we got more information and we're more comfortable with our assumptions, we looked at the effects on the calf as well. And it ends up being pretty similar to the estimates that there are for lactating cows heat stress. About $1.5 billion a year to the US dairy industry is what we'd see with dry cow heat stress versus lactation heat stress. So it's significant in terms of what people can do. I mean, my first sort of piece of advice is make sure they get their dry cows cooled. Okay, you got to figure out how, whatever your heat abatement system is, get them cooled off. And the other thing that I try and emphasize to people is not to downplay heat stress, not to think, oh, well, it only gets hot here for a couple of weeks a year. It's not too bad. And we can get beyond that. Number one, cows get heat stress before we do, right? They've got a big heat generator inside of them called the rumen that's just pushing out heat. And so they get heat stress before we will. And so using our own level of comfort isn't appropriate for what those cows need. Beside the fact that we typically go from the air conditioned house to the air conditioned truck to the air conditioned office at the farm. And so, sure, heat stress isn't too bad because we're not out in that barn. So I think really understanding when cows get heat stressed is important. And when we've done estimates of how much of the year different areas will be heat stressed, at least for the top dairy states in the US, comes out to about 3 months a year is what we can expect for heat stress. So you might say, well, 3/4 of the year shouldn't have any problem. If you assume that you have the same number of cows calving every month, that means at least a quarter of your herd is potentially heat stressed when they're dry if you don't have heat abatement for them.
Yeah. Well, and I know under our Canadian system is that we're pretty heavy calvers through June, July, August.
And typically what we see is most places that's going to be a little delayed. It's actually a little later that you're going to start to see heavier calving August, September, October. And so there's even more of the herd that is potentially heat stressed than that 25% estimate would be. So yeah, it's more of a negative effect and more of a potential economic effect than people realize. In the environment, as we talked about, where you have high humidity and high heat, you really need to get water on those cows and get it moved away. Soak them down to the skin, get fans on them so that we can move that water off of them and take heat with it. Using fans, I think sometimes makes us feel more comfortable or we feel better about it, but I'm not sure how effectively that really cools animals. And when, studies have been done looking at fans alone, soakers alone, or the combination, and the combination by far is much better at heat abatement than either fans or soakers alone. Sometimes you're just moving hot air over those animals and it really doesn't do much for heat abatement.
Well, I know I always get the pushback from producers that water puts too much manure in the pit, or too much water in the manure pit. And then I've been under the impression that they're either going to drink it or you're going to dump it on them. One or the other, that water's going to end up in the manure pit. So
yeah, and it's interesting. We did a study last summer with some of these newer soakers that only come on when the cow is there versus the sort of typical system that we have that they come on every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, regardless of whether there's a cow under them or not. And it's interesting to your point that our traditional system used more water when we looked at the total amount of water going through the soakers and the total amount that the cows were consuming. Right. So we put it all together and did a total volume for those cows on that treatment. The newer soakers that use a lot less water because you don't spray every 5 minutes, whether there's a cow there or not. There really wasn't a difference when we looked at total water between them and the heat stress cows. Yeah. But the cooling was much more effective when it was going on their backs versus the cows that were under heat stress that didn't have any soakers and were just increasing their water intake. So you're exactly right that putting it on their back seems to have a much greater effect, at least from this one sort of small study, than allowing them to just drink more water. And you're not going to change. We didn't change the total amount of water that either of those groups were putting into the manure system. So you can have very different outcomes to the same amount of water depending on how it's applied.
It's just where you want to allocate it, I guess. And then in your hierarchy, dry cows are the number one place to cool. Where would number two be?
Yeah. I mean, I used to get that question in the first couple of years. People would say, you can only cool one group of cows on the farm. Who do you cool? And I'd say dry cows. And they'd look at me like I was crazy. So, from my perspective, right, we want to get the dry cows cooled, and then I'd look at our holding pen. If we're putting animals through a milking parlor, make sure those cows are cooled. I would probably then look at my early to mid lactation cows. And so that's sort of waffling a little bit, but we don't have enough information. We've got some information that says that those mid lactation cows actually don't persist as well if they've been heat stressed at any time. So that would be the next group that I'm looking at, sort of peak to post-peak animals is where I'm going to be looking. But bottom line is we want to get all our cows cooled, right? If we're milking cows, we want to make sure that we've got effective heat abatement in place. And that heat abatement needs to be effective when we've got heat stress. And I think that, even in Ontario, as you say, across the upper Midwest, the Northeast, it doesn't last as long as our heat stress here, but you've got significant heat stress. I mean, I'm sorry, but when it gets to 98 degrees for 2 weeks straight, we're going to have significant heat stress. And it does that in that sort of range with pretty fair regularity. And it seems to be getting more and more regular that it occurs. So we need to be thinking about it, even if we don't necessarily need it in October and November like we needed here in Florida.
No, and I mean, our heat stress here, I would say probably it seems like it's starting more, and it's likely starting in April in short bouts, but by the time we get into mid to late May, early June, like we're getting some significant bouts of heat stress where we're talking about, 90 degrees or 32°C weather with, anywhere from 70 to 90% humidity. Now it's a little bit different this year. Like we had a really, really warm week where it was 30 plus degrees or 90 plus Fahrenheit for 5 or 6 days in a row. And at night, like it really wasn't, it was dropping a bit, but not much. And low humidity, but still like you could you see it. I see it in the bulk tanks. Like when I start looking at people's milk pickups on a Monday morning or whatever, like looking back at the week before, like you see it in component production, you see it in milk production. And I did some quick math because I knew you threw that number of a billion. There's a 1.1 billion or something like that cost
1.5.
One and a half. Yeah. So I did a little bit of math on 9 million cows in the US. That's about not quite $170 a day US or $170 cost per cow in the US per lactation. Like I know what I could do with I could buy some nice fishing equipment with some $180, but
and a good year profitability on a cow will be $450 to $500. So
you're looking at a third of her profitability right there,
potentially.
What about fans? Like I know I've done this in the past, and I'm always on people to kind of lower their turn off point on fans. So a lot of people have their fans say turn off at 18°C. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, maybe 65 or 68 degrees. And I've had people move that point down because like the cycle through the day, like the cow's not going to peak in her body temp until what, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night.
Yeah. I mean, they accumulate heat during the day, it seems, and then get rid of it at night. So yeah, I think that we want to look not just right at the heat, but kind of what our humidity level is as well. But you can probably get away with your fan setting from a temperature perspective a little lower if we've got water going on to those cows as well. And as I said before, just having the fans somewhat effective. It's certainly from a ventilation perspective important, but I'm not sure that we get a whole lot of cooling regardless of where our temperature is on those animals.
Yeah, you have to get the water on them, and I think we should maybe kind of look at it differently too. In the upper Midwest or the Southeast, like we've got to do evaporative cooling, not
correct.
I can't think of the word right now.
We're not cooling the air.
Yes, we're cooling the cow. Yeah, right. So fine mist doesn't help.
Exactly. In order to get that cow cool, she has to get wet on her skin. And what I make the analogy, whether I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, but I think it helps people sometimes. You go to the beach, you lay out, you get hot, you go in, you get wet, you come out, you're cool. As that breeze sort of blows that water off of you, you feel yourself cooling off. And so that's the same type of thing that we want in a more arid environment where we can actually look at getting a mist of water, and that's going to take some of that heat out of the air and cool the air. Then we could use those. But that's why I use the term soakers. I don't use misters. I don't use sprinklers. I mean, we want them soaked. That I do that on purpose because that's what we need to get the cows wet down on their backs.
And I'm not sure what your situation is in Florida with robotic milking. I don't know. Is there a lot of robots in Florida,
Not really any at all at this point. Part of that is my understanding when I tried to get some robots, we're too far from where there are other robots at this point. So
No dealer network.
From a technical perspective, they didn't have the help to repair them, so they didn't want to get into a new territory. So you can see that they're kind of moving out from the upper Midwest Canada.
Yeah. And then, so it's kind of interesting. So I've had some producers hook up shower nozzles in them. So when the front gate opens, they just get a complete blast of water down on their back for however many seconds or till the cow leaves. And then the front gate closes and the tap shuts off. And we're seeing increased visits in the summer.
Yeah.
Like 0.1, 0.2, like 0.3 in some instances, but
I've done some work down in Mexico, and again, more arid environment down there, but open lots. And so what they would do with their dry cows is bring them up to the showers. They would walk them up there a few times a day, get them soaking wet. They'd go back, lay down. That water's going to move off of them, take heat with them. And they saw good responses in those animals. That was in a dry cow study, but they see good responses in those animals. So it's the same thing. If they're going to be hot, let's get them cooled off where we can, when we can.
Is there any heat abatement considerations like from like mechanical ventilation or cooling, like with calves? Or are they relatively resilient?
No, it'll decrease intake. It'll decrease growth rate. I think a lot of it can be overcome with shade and making sure we have appropriate shade. Calf hutches can become little ovens, despite the fact that they're light colored, particularly if we don't have good air movement around those hutches. So I think we can, we don't have to be as extreme on our heat abatement, but certainly getting shade to those animals, making sure that, if we do have real hot conditions, that we think about what we might want to do, particularly I think as the animals get a little older and get a little larger and a little less able to get rid of heat, what we're going to do for heat abatement. Certainly springing heifers, we did a study with those animals, and when we cooled them before they, 2 months before they had their first calf, they end up making more milk in the first lactation. So it's a biologically sort of consistent response, whether it's her first lactation or her fifth lactation, does the same thing.
There's an impact to it.
Yep.
Was there any final thoughts that you had, or any, I don't know, tidbits or anecdotes for producers out there when thinking about heat stress?
Yeah, no, I think we covered most of the work that we've done and most of the recommendations that I would have, but I would emphasize to people to really think about not assuming that because you're not as hot or don't feel as hot, that the cow doesn't feel as hot, because they do get heat stress before we do. And we need to consider that when we're thinking about our heat stress abatement and how important it is to prioritize that as a management decision.
Yeah, that's a really good point to end off with. So, Geoffrey, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know, like I mentioned in the beginning, I've used your studies a lot over the past few years, or almost my entire career. So I truly do appreciate you coming on and spending some time and talking to the listeners about heat stress, something pretty important to us this time of year.
All right. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.